Okay, in this video, we're going to look at some perspectives from psychology as they pertain to child development. But we're going to look at a number of psychological theories which really center on the relationship between a learner and a mediator, I guess a kind of a mentor or a teacher. But a mediator is kind of a special relationship that comes across in a few psychological theories. We're going to look mainly at the work of Vygotsky, who was a developmental psychologist in Russia in the first half of the 20th century. Carl Rogers, who was an American humanist psychologist. He did his most important writings in the 50s and the 60s, I guess you could say. And Feuerstein, who was a Romanian Jewish psychologist who, after World War II, settled in Israel and did a great deal of developmental psychology work. We'll look at some other related approaches and then talk about the concept of proximal factors and distal factors in learning. This is about factors that have a strong influence or a proximal influence, or have a distal influence, which is a weaker influence on whether someone learns or not and what they learn. So we'll begin with Vygotsky, who single-handedly developed his own approach to psychology, which is called now socio-cultural psychology. Vygotsky was interesting. He died in his late 30s from tuberculosis, and he knew for some years that he was going to pass away. So he worked very hard for several years to get down as much of his thinking as possible. And what remains is quite an incredible amount of very lively, energetic writing about his theory. He was influenced by Marxist theory and also by Marx's main collaborator Engels, and his influence here doesn't seem to have been a political choice based on the Soviet Union coming into being in 1917. He seemed to have a strong connection with the thinking of Marx and Engels prior to this, and certainly his writings and his theories were rapidly became unpopular in Soviet Russia. So he definitely maintained an independent perspective. So he had a dialectical and a historical perspective that he applied to psychology. Dialectical perspective in this sense means the notion that as people act in their environment around them, they're acting on themselves at the same time. The environment turns around and acts on them. So there's an ongoing relationship between people and the environment that they seek to act in. And there was particularly some work of Engels that Vygotsky was very closely drawn to around the dialectic philosophy. The dialectic came before Marx and Engels from Hegel, really. But obviously Marx popularized it in his works. Vygotsky's concern was largely around how humans were able to create very large and complex symbolic systems or signifying systems as a means to extend their native thinking skills and their planning and imagination beyond the immediate field of their senses. So he looked at humans and he looked at other primates, and he noticed that so monkeys will try to plan, but they can only really plan based on what they can see in front of them to a large extent. He wanted to understand how did humans develop their thinking in a way which let them plan ahead about things that they couldn't see yet. He developed a theory of mediated learning as well, that suggested that people were able to learn more rapidly if they were close to somebody who was more learned and was able to offer them support in their learning. He called this the zone of proximal development. This is probably his most well-known idea now. It's often referred to as scaffolding in the modern context. It's the idea that you can provide learning supports for someone to speed up their process of learning for themselves. And so Vygotsky thought that a relationship with a teacher or a mediator, as well as any kind of object that aided the memory, any kind of symbolic object like a note or something that was created to remind somebody of something, serves as a stimulus for learning and for performance, and extends the human mind beyond what they can immediately see or hear or feel. So Vygotsky was quite big on symbolism and symbolic learning, and he applied this to a large extent in research, developmental research with children. He was interested to find out how does children's development work, and how does their symbolic understandings and their skill with symbolic systems correlate to their development. What he suggested was that symbolic activity is generated more and more as children grow in their capability to understand, interpret and use symbolic gestures and systems in their own lives, language being the most prominent and obvious example of this. He found that symbolic activity became a kind of an organizing influence on a child's developing mind. And this was closely related to children's efforts to fit themselves into a social environment that they found themselves in. I mean, this wasn't to say that every child went about it the same way. Children have different strategies. So for children who wanted to just get along with everyone and fit in, they were using their understanding of language and their symbolic understandings to get along well with people and to feel like people were comfortable with them and liked them. For children who wanted to be in charge, they tended to start using the language and the symbolic elements of culture to assert themselves and to find ways of getting their own way and so forth. So in general, Vygotsky said that speech produces a symbolic field where children can structure their internal environment and also their external environment and visualize it in great detail beyond what their senses could provide for them. And then combined with their awareness, their symbolic understanding and their memory, they become able to make responses that go beyond the immediate stimuli around them. One really important aspect of this that Vygotsky put a fair bit of attention into was play. And Vygotsky's suggestion was that play, rather than just fooling around or being random, was quite intentional on the part of children. It was an effort by children to understand social roles, either social roles that they were already involved in or social roles that they had become aware of through symbolic understanding. He talked about children pretending to be things that they'd heard about, but he also talked about children pretending to be something that matched a current social status that they had. In particular, he talked about two sisters who one day pretended to be sisters. I've actually had an equivalent experience of this where my son asked me one day to pretend to be his dad. And I suspended being his real father and pretended to be his father, and he pretended to be my son. So what's going on in a situation like that? What Vygotsky would suggest is that this isn't fooling around. This is a child becoming very earnest about following what they understand as being the rules of that particular social relationship. So for two girls pretending to be each other's sisters when they are biologically sisters, they're suspending all of their other hopes and wishes and putting all of their effort into what they understand as the social norms for being a sister. In real life, they don't always act like that because there's more to them than just being a sister to the other girl. There's other hopes, there's other wishes, there's other relationships, there's other obligations. But children intentionally put a focus on particular relationships, particular symbolic understandings and linkages in order to deepen their understanding of these. This is what Vygotsky was suggesting to us. In terms of speech, he said that speech takes on a planning function for children. As children develop in speech, they begin to objectify themselves in relation to their environment. And this is a critically different psychological step for humans in relation to other animals, that children begin to see themselves externally and begin to then be able to understand themselves in relation to their environment with a higher degree of sophistication. They can pull back from themselves and say, now, if I did this, what would happen? If I don't do this, what would happen? If I wait for this, what will be the result? And so on. And he goes on to say that then all of these processes, all of this development, it's essential for reliable social integration of the child into their social environment. It's essential for their relationship formation. He calls it the socialization of the child's practical intellect. Now, moving a few decades into the future, we come to Carl Rogers, who was not really a developmental psychologist. He was a therapist, and he was one of the leaders of the humanist school of psychology. He wrote an interesting paper in the late 1950s where he talked about what he called the conditions of therapeutic personality change. He suggested that these were the elements that he found that whenever they were all present, something positive happened in the therapeutic relationship he had with one of his clients. What he said was involved in this was really a relationship between the client and the therapist, where the client was in what he called an incongruent state, and where the therapist was congruent in relation to the client in that relationship. We'll look at what he means by congruence and incongruence in the next slide. But it can be taken that the therapist here is in a better position, a stronger position, has more a stronger perspective on reality or on a particular context in a way that's going to be helpful for the client. He says that during the course of the therapeutic relationship, then, if the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for the client and has an insight into the client's psychological frame of reference and is able to communicate this understanding, if the client can understand what's being said to him and realizes, oh, this therapist understands me and accepts me, there's going to be an internal development within that client. He puts this in as simple language as he can, and it's quite an easy article to read if you can come across it. And it's very interesting that he says no matter what kind of official psychological process I'm undertaking, as long as these elements are in play, something good's going to happen. So what he means by congruence or incongruence here is that he suggests somebody is incongruent when they're seeking to maintain a self-image which is not accurate in relation to their actual experience. And so if we think back to Vygotsky's suggestions about children and their efforts with play and their efforts to use language and their efforts to objectify themselves in their environment, we can see that in a way this is children seeking to find the correct placement for themselves in relation to their experience in their social environment. And so play is one way of doing this. Relationship with people is another valuable way of doing this. And as children grow, they develop to more or less extent a certain amount of congruence, but there will be always a certain amount of incongruence, and none of us totally get it. What Rogers says is when a person has no perception of this incongruence, they're subject to anxiety and disorganization whenever there's an inconsistency encountered. So if a child, for example, does not understand that they've got the wrong idea about their relationship in a given context, they're going to get upset. They're going to lose the ability to think straight when something goes wrong. And for some people, this can persist into adulthood to some extent. When there's the beginning of an awareness of incongruence, this results in a state of tension, and the inconsistent experience is perceived as some kind of threat, an external threat, but it's not fully understood. So it creates more worry, more anxiety, and so on. Whereas in a congruent personality, self-concept has been shaped reasonably well to conform with experience, so that anxiety isn't so common. So we can find a fairly close relationship between this line of thinking of Rogers and some of the thought of Vygotsky around mediated learning. Vygotsky explains human development via the formation of the use of symbols and signifying systems, which is facilitated by relationship with people who have a stronger grasp of those symbols and systems. So again, children start imitating these, and through experience, they begin to internalize these systems, start to learn to use them. They respond to feedback from adults, from people who understand the systems much better, and this is their social normalization process. Rogers, in a therapeutic context, explains therapeutic change via the experience of acceptance and empathy by someone who is more integrated and more congruent in their context. So this is really, in a sense, an adult experiencing something in adulthood, which is what children are seeking in childhood in terms of finding their place in the social setting. Central to both of these theories is the idea that something occurs in the mind of a learner as a direct result of their placement in an environment alongside a more integrated or a more experienced mediator. And where a successful communication has occurred around a specific matter, which has a therapeutic or a learning significance to the learner. So where there's going to be some kind of emotional development or some kind of cognitive development as a result of that communication taking place. So Roiven Feuerstein came along and developed a very elaborate system along the same lines. He doesn't appear to have been aware of Vygotsky, and he, after training in psychology and moving to Israel after World War II, he immediately found himself working with children who had been, who'd experienced the Holocaust and were severely traumatized. And he realized that there was a great need to understand what was going on for these children and to find ways for them to learn despite their trauma, and to try to restore their psychological well-being and their ability to function in the society. He went on after this to work with children with developmental delays, with children who are severely autistic, as well as continuing to work at times with children who've been severely neglected and abused. And he had a remarkable track record of working with children who, after years of abuse or neglect, were developmentally delayed to a significant level, and partially or in some cases more or less completely normalizing their developmental trajectory through the specific cognitive processes that he developed. He also developed quite an elaborate system of measuring and diagnostics and measuring of people's abstract thinking skills and cognitive skills. Unfortunately, all of his work is very proprietary, so you can't find a whole lot of detail about it. But some of the indications that you're able to find online and so forth, quite compelling. What Feuerstein suggested was followed on from Piaget and other early developmental psychologists in suggesting that learners are in the midst of a stimulus response model, but he suggested that mediators could enter that space and be involved in influencing some of the stimuli that reach the learner. He pinpointed a few characteristics of a mediation relationship which were critically important in improving the development of the learner. He talked about the mediator's intentionality, providing meaningful filters for the stimuli and then providing meaningful filters for the mediator's own responses in communication with the learner, as a way of shaping the perception and the cognition of these stimuli by the learner. He talked about the mediator assisting the learner in considering how learning and development in one area of thinking could be abstracted out and then applied to other areas of thinking more broadly. A lot of work was done in this area, and the aim of this really was to lead to autonomous thinking in the learners. He also suggested that mediators can transmit their messages to the learner with specific meaning, and so that the values really of the mediator are quite important for them to be intentional, specific, and tailored to the developmental requirements of the learner. There are a number of related approaches to Feuerstein's work. There's a number of systems that have developed out of his thinking. Among these are cognitive enrichment advantage and philosophy for children, which both look at ways for children to learn actively through diverse methods. The reflective cycle is another one of these. Narrative practice isn't born out of Feuerstein's work. It's been developed really out of post-structuralist philosophy around breaking down assumptions about people being a certain character. It's more that people live by their stories and can change their stories quite intentionally, and choose what they take on and what they don't, and this will ultimately influence their capacity to view themselves positively, to learn, to grow. It's much more than an educational perspective, narrative practice. Another interesting one, which seems very experimental still, is peer mediation with young children, which one of the leaders of this is a student of Feuerstein, David Serial, and it's related to children assisting other children to learn. Serial has done some interesting work on the relationship of Feuerstein's method of mediation for children, and particularly for children with learning difficulties and other learning disadvantages in more modern times. So out of all of this, all these psychological concepts of learning, we come to a concept around proximal factors and distal factors in learning. What this suggests is that based on developmental psychology of Vygotsky and Feuerstein, but also on concepts in bioecology, that there's factors in a person's life, in a children's life and in their development, which are quite proximal to their development. They're close to the centre of attention of the child and will have a fairly decisive or highly influential impact on their ability to learn. So if we think of normal development, we might think of a child where there's been no significant trauma, no significant loss. There isn't a particular learning difficulty or anything of that nature. The proximal factors for those children in terms of their learning may be a reliable caregiver or two reliable caregivers. It might be early childhood educators. So the proximal factors for their learning are going to be positive ones. For children who have a learning difficulty, it's suggested that this can form a proximal factor. So then achieving a similar or better influence over a child's learning requires a much greater degree of intentionality and effort. Otherwise, the effort to teach someone remains distal in comparison to the learning difficulty. The same can apply, of course, to working with adults. And this may well apply to some of the parents and caregivers in your work context. If you're working with families where parents have experienced trauma, have experienced significant loss, have their own challenges with learning in the Australian context, it's going to take a fair amount of effort to connect with them and to work effectively with them. competing proximal factors in relation to learning can take on many forms. So definitely specific learning difficulties such as the autism spectrum, but other things such as trauma, abuse and neglect, addiction or intoxication, mental health issues, experience or witnessing of domestic and family violence, homelessness or excessive transition, the experience of resettlement, acquired brain injury. There's many things that can have a significant impact on learning. Where this is the case, having a general understanding of mediated learning may not be enough. There may be a need to have some specialised training or to develop experience and intuition in that regard. In terms of resources, I'd really suggest, if you can find a copy of Mind and Society or see what you can find in this relation online. This is a collection of Vygotsky's writings, which make for great reading actually, and really show the intellectual brilliance that Vygotsky had. This is the piece of work that talks about the zone of proximal development, talks a great deal about symbolism, the importance of play, and many other themes. There's quite a lot of resources available on the zone of proximal development or scaffolding or some of the other names that the concept is given. For Rogers, the article, The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Therapeutic Personality Change, although it's not directly related to development or child development, it's very interesting to read in light of the arguments that Vygotsky and Feuerstein put forward in terms of the importance of a mediating influence. Feuerstein's work is a bit harder to come across because it's all more or less proprietary, but it's worth having a look at him and his life and the influence that he has had on psychology. There are other approaches as per the links given earlier in this video. So that's one particular psychological perspective that can be applied to working with children around creating an intentional mediating space to support learning and development. I hope that it's been helpful to look at that, as well as to consider the importance of symbolic learning, the importance of play, including open-ended play, which children can direct for themselves as well, because these are the kinds of experiences where children will determine for themselves what is it important for them to learn right now, what are the missing links that they've identified that they want to explore. And in terms of working with parents, obviously when you're working with people who've experienced learning difficulties or trauma or destabilization, it's very important to be sensitive to that and to understand if you're not able to make a connection or make progress, or if you're concerned about not being able to introduce a parent to having the appropriate child focus, or what we believe by our standards is an appropriate child focus. There can be a lot of other factors at play. It's always something worth exploring and worth learning about.